And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this low pressure area drifting northward out over the Bering Sea, and the front hanging up along the southwest coast here, pressing up towards St. Lawrence Island. So snow and blowing snow continues with winter storm and blizzard warnings out for many areas here in the west, spreading northward to the northwest coast, across the Seward Peninsula, coming very windy over the interior here, as you can see with a tight gradient there, all the way over to the Canadian border, and some rain spreading into Kodiak Island. Rain continues at times for the Alaska Peninsula, but not as heavy as when the front first came through earlier today and last night. Very strong winds, high wind warning out for the Juneau Douglas area for gusts 65 miles per hour. Wind chill advisories out for the Klondike Highway up toward Haines and Skagway for cold wind chills with those gusty winds. That continues through tomorrow as well. Dry and cold, gusty winds for the Panhandle, eastern interior, cold and dry, warmer, windier, and a lot more snow and blowing snow here, especially Yukon Delta northward to the northwest coast and the western Arctic coastal areas there. Stays rather windy over portions of the interior, especially the higher elevations. And this system coming up brings gale force winds and rain to Kodiak Island and storm force winds to Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, as we'll see in a little bit here. Next system pushing wind and rain and snow into the Aleutians. And for the Friday outlook, this front here kind of falls apart here along the coast, but still a pretty good gradient in advance of that front. So snow and blowing snow continues. St. Lawrence Island, portions of the Seward Peninsula into Yukon Delta. More of a mixed precipitation pattern there for the Kuskokwim Delta. Probably just flat out rain. Areas up for the Bristol Bay area. Heavy at times on the rainfall for the Alaska Peninsula with gale force winds with that next system pushing eastward. Increasing snow, milder temperatures, or at least highs in the 20s, milder overnight low temperatures for southern Alaska here, with increasing snow along the western Alaska Range, southern Kenai Peninsula, North Gulf Coast. Panhandle, a lot less wind, and still mostly clear, and temperatures on the cold side. Eastern interior, a little milder with less wind, but still below zero. For coastal water forecast for tomorrow on the south coast, your east winds 20 gusting 35 knots. And for the north coast, roughly east at 30 to 35 knots and 25 to 35 knots for the north coast there. Seas ranging from 8 feet on the southern coast to 11 to 12 feet up to the north. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay area, north winds 30 knots with gusts of 45, Stevens Passage northeast at 30, and Clarence Strait northwesterlies at 20 knots, 7-foot seas. And then much lighter winds for Friday here for the south coast, east at 15 knots, central coast, central and north coast actually, all east 10 to 15 knots, and north at 15 for Lynn Canal, northeast at 15 for Stevens Passage, north winds 15 knots for Clarence Strait. Prince William Sound tomorrow, east winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas there. Otherwise, the central and eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds at 30 knots. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, east at 35 knots. Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, storm warnings, east winds 50 knots, seas 13 to 14 feet. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the next day, northern Cook Inlet, winds come down to about 15 knots out of the northeast. Prince William Sound east at 15 knots. And bring it under storm force winds there for the Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands area. Just 5 knots less though, but 45 out of the east for both those areas. And continued gale force easterlies for the western North Gulf Coast, eastern North Gulf Coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, east winds 45 knots. For the day on Thursday, Alaska Peninsula, west-northwest, 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, gale warnings, east winds at 40 knots with seas at 9 feet. And for Friday, for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, southeast at 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, east-southeasterlies at 40 knots with seas up to 20 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, east or west to southwest winds at 20 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, south winds at 30 knots, 9 to 11-foot seas there. And for the western Aleutians, east to northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And for Friday, Western Aleutians, Shimiatakiska, west winds 30 to 35 knots, and then gale force northwest winds from Chitka at 40 knots, turn westerly at 40 knots across Adak and Atka. And then for the eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds 25 to 35 knots. For the southwest coast tomorrow, gale warnings, 40-knot winds south of Nunivak Island out of the southeast, 35-knot southeast winds, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, east 45 knots there for Norton Sound, southeast 20 for St. Matthew Island, southwest 20 for the Pribilofs. And for Friday, Pribilof Island, southeast winds 20 knots, east 25 for St. Matthew Island, and southeast winds 30 to 35 knots for the southwest coast, and southeast 30 knots St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, southeasterly gales at 35 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 20 to 25 knots, and sustained 25-knot winds, burst wind advisories for the central coast, gale warnings for the western Arctic coast east at 35 knots, and east-southeast winds 45 knots here for the Chukchi Sea. And then for Friday, gale warnings continue for the Chukchi Sea out of the east and southeast, 35 to 40 knots. And then brisk wind advisories for the central and western Arctic coast, east winds 25 knots, east winds 30 to 35 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea.